Hello and welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. I'm Eric Young. Today I'm speaking with Dorothy Dankel about her recent publication which deals with science advice in situations of uncertainty.
Why are we playing a game where we're pretending to know? We're not ready to be wrong about this number, but we are inherently wrong because we cannot be right.
Uncertainty is a central concept in the deep sea mining conversation. And while the article we discuss focuses on the fisheries industry, the takeaways and discussion are clearly applicable not only to deep sea mining, but to a lot of the questions around how the authority of science informs public discussion, which has become an increasingly fraught topic in recent years. I hope you'll find the discussion interesting. We get into Dorothy's research on science advice and epistemic authority, the challenges of integrating scientific knowledge with policy, lessons from investigative journalism and how they're relevant to the field of research, trade-offs in managing natural resources with incomplete data, the intersection of deep sea mining, sustainability, and ethical decision-making, and why intellectual humility is essential in high-stakes scientific debates. Without further ado, I bring you Dorothy Dankel. Okay.
Hi, Eric.
Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
Okay, so with me today is Dorothy Dankel. Dorothy is a mentor of mine. We work in the same research group here at Synth Ocean, though she lives in a different city and is an extremely busy woman. So any time with her is always valuable. I'll let Dorothy introduce herself, but Dorothy has recently published a wonderful paper on the philosophy of science and how we should relate to knowledge and uncertainty and to scientific authority in context of decision-making. I'm very excited that I managed to grab an hour of Dorothy's time for this as she was passing through Trondheim. So, Dorothy, I'd like to start the same way that Andrew Sullivan starts all of his podcasts. And that is by asking, where did you grow up? What did your parents do?
I think it's really cozy to be asked that question because I think in the professional setting, you don't usually get to talk about where you came from. And I'm such a big fan of my parents. So to be able to bring them into this sphere is really fun. So I grew up in northeastern Indiana in the Midwest in a small town called Kendallville. And Kendallville was founded around 1840, I think, when Indiana became a state, and they didn't have a name for the town. And so they found, for whatever reason, the Postmaster General for the United States was Mr. Kendall. So then they just named the town Kendallville. But we're just north of Fort Wayne, and Fort Wayne is a larger city in Indiana. And my parents, they met in high school, or high school sweethearts. But my mother was born in New Haven, Connecticut, because my grandfather went to Yale, and they lived in New Haven for a while, had 4 kids, but then my grandfather moved back to Indiana because he was from South Bend to buy, his big intention was to buy the newspaper, but he couldn't because it wasn't for sale yet because he was a journalist. So my mom started, I think it was elementary school, then middle school, and then met my dad in high school. And my dad was a sports writer for the newspaper, worked under my grandfather who became owner and publisher. And they got married in 1977, and I was their firstborn in 1979. My father was in the Army. He and his twin brother were the very first people drafted for the Vietnam War from Indiana when we had the draft. So my dad went to boot camp, and then the war ended, so he didn't have to go overseas, thankfully. But my mom went to Indiana University and School of Journalism and has been a journalist, still is writing. Dad took over the paper and was publisher and retired some years back. And we finally sold our family business to a company that would take care of it and the local people. I think my grandfather expanded the paper from maybe 20 employees to 120. And local news is the passion of our family and community. And so those good Midwestern values and Hoosier hospitality, as somebody from Indiana is a Hoosier, if you don't know that, that's your trivia for the day. Yeah, cool. That's something that was really important for me growing up. And Mom and Dad were almost always at work, in the sense that always thinking about, what's the scoop? What's the story? Did you know that happened at hospital board? And maybe the mayor's going to say this type of, and we would get phone calls all the time because of people saying, hey, have you heard about this? Or you need to put this in the paper, or that was a good article, or my son got arrested last night and you will not publish that tomorrow morning type of, and how they have had to massage those conversations and things like this. So my parents were really a team that you have to be in a family business. I also, one of the traditions that I grew up with that I have brought into my own family now in Norway with my husband and our 3 children is there's always at least one, if not 2 or 3, newspapers on the kitchen table. I grew up with the newspaper, not just our newspaper, but the Fort Wayne, 2 Fort Wayne newspapers and the Christian Science Monitor and all these like really good journalistic pieces. Newsweek and Time were always on the kitchen table. I have something like at breakfast, I need my newspaper. I can't stand the phone at breakfast and I can't stand just looking at bare wood. I have to have a newspaper. So we have our 3 newspapers on the table. It annoys my husband sometimes, but actually Norwegians are I think in the country, in the world that has the most newspaper subscriptions. That's something to be fact checked.
I hear Norwegians are also the country that drinks the most coffee. So
coffee and newspapers. I grew up a lot with that.
Okay, and then can you take us briefly from how did you go from third generation journalist family in Indiana to researcher in Bergen, Norway?
Yeah, so I think I remember the first time I consciously saw the ocean. I think I was 6 or 7, and we had a family vacation someplace on the eastern seaboard. And I just, there was something about the Atlantic Ocean and the waves and this. And I definitely remember the first time I saw the Pacific Ocean in California. And I mean, it's just like a type of falling in love of, oh my gosh, if there's so much going on in the surface and all that power, just think of what's underneath it. And luckily my grandparents, my mother's parents built a house in Key West, Florida, in 1989. And they enrolled me into Sea Camp the summer of 1994, a marine biology camp on Big Pine Key, which I highly, highly recommend. It was totally, for me, one of those real milestone moments where at the age of, that summer I turned 15. So I was 14. I got my scuba certification, my NAUI's scuba certification after those 2.5 weeks at Sea Camp. And to be able to do, because we have to do the math and the physics and, the dive tables. And that's really cool as a 14-year-old to see, okay, this is why we do math. So we don't die. And learning all that. But then we got to dive at Looe Key, National Marine Sanctuary. And this is the 3rd largest barrier reef in the world. And in 1994, there was still a lot of coral there. And I was just... to be able to go down on your knees on a sandy bottom for 20 minutes and just observe was just, it was just awesome. I just kind of was trying to figure out how do you do this for a living? And the only thing I could attach it to was to work in an aquarium. And so when I told my mom, so my mother's mother, who I grew up right next door to my grandparents because when mom and dad got married, they were looking to buy a house in Kendallville, and the house next door to mom's parents was for sale. So they just bought it. And it wasn't because they were looking to be right next to the in-laws, but that's how it happened. So for me to be the oldest grandchild, I had a very close relationship, wonderful relationship with all 4 of my grandparents. My dad's parents lived 5 miles in the next small town where my dad grew up. So lots of fabulous memories. But it was my mother's parents that really introduced me to the ocean. And when I figured out that, okay, maybe I could work at an aquarium. And mom is like, you know what, you could do a lot more things. But they also really encouraged me not to start to specialize in marine biology during my bachelor's. I was looking at different marine biology programs. And both my grandmother, who went to Smith College, her mother went to Smith. Ironically enough, both of my great grandmothers, whose children married each other, they were friends at Smith College, all women's college in Massachusetts. Were also my aunt and my sister. My sister's 4th generation Smithy. I wasn't so book smart to get into Smith, but I followed the advice of my grandparents and my mom that, okay, well, maybe they said, just do biology. And then if you want to do marine biology, do a master's or something like that. And I mean, they were paying for my college education. So I also kind of had to take that advice, and it was good advice. And I got into a liberal arts college where, I have a very warm place in my heart for liberal arts colleges and the understanding of the whole getting kind of the basic psychology, the basic philosophy, the basic religion, the basic, all these good humanities things, but also getting a major in biology. That's like super cool. And that fit my brain really, really well, because I love how pieces come together and how one thing affects another and this type of thing. But I inherently am a natural scientist. I love the natural world and I love everything that's salty. So then I eventually got into the ocean when I moved to Norway.
Well, that makes sense then why you've ended up in kind of philosophy of science if you got both a liberal arts and a scientific start in things and appreciate the value of both. Okay, so then before we get onto the substance of your new paper, I'm always interested in how research compares to journalism, because sometimes I feel like what I do as a researcher is basically just
investigative journalism.
It's just journalism, only probably like better paid, less stressful, and with a poor understanding of narrative.
Yeah, and with easier deadlines.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I reflect on that a lot, and of course that has formed kind of how I view the world. I mean, my grandfather also had CIA training, so he was in the CIA during the Cold War, and this kind of interrogation also. I was interrogated a lot as a child by him in good ways. But investigative journalism is a foundation of our democracy, if you just say it right out there. And there's not that many places left that invest in investigative journalism. There's a lot of countries around the world, including Norway, that do significant investments in research. But there's a limit to that type of research. Of course, we can't come up with numbers for everything. But to understand how, for example, a model projection or a temperature measurement relates to something larger, you have to kind of ask questions. And there's not one person who kind of gets it. So you have to ask a lot of different people relatively the same question, but get it from their point of view and stitch that story together. So what is the story? I mean, as a oldest of 4 children, and mom worked from home. So she did all her writing at home because we were 4 kids to have somebody at home. But dad, of course, most of his career, he was editor, and he would come home at 5, almost on the dot, and we'd see the car come up. He'd come up and he would come in and he'd whistle, do a little whistle like, and then we knew he was home. And then mom just always was like the gut reaction when she heard the door, heard the whistle, she would say, "What's the scoop?" And then he would say, a 3-sentence summary of what happened that day. We sit down, say a prayer, have our dinner, and then start our evening together, which always included watching the national news. And that was for me, I just was very interested in news, and that journalism being a discipline with rules and standards of what questions can you ask? What are the tough questions? What are the inappropriate questions that you don't ask? But what are the tough questions? Also, I grew up on Sundays as a family. We watched 60 Minutes and then Murder, She Wrote. And Murder, She Wrote, I don't know, did you grow up with that?
I read every Agatha Christie book.
Okay, yeah.
Those around, but I never saw the show.
Well, so Angela Lansbury, one of the big iconic actresses of the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
My mom did watch this.
Yeah. I mean, it was on CBS, and it was one of the longest running. I mean, it was just brilliant. So it's every show's a murder mystery. And Angela Lansbury plays Jessica Fletcher. She's a writer from Maine. By the way, I love Maine. I don't know if we're going to get on that topic, but I love Maine. And she's from a fictional place called Cabot Cove, Maine. And she writes murder mysteries. So she's a writer, and she uses her, investigative mind as a writer with characters to understand how to piece the puzzle together. And then, watching 60 Minutes, the iconic CBS journalistic review where they take, what are the big topics to go into depth, and then murder. I mean, and we watched this as a family. I mean, everyone on the sofa watching this. So it was, very formative, and it really got into my head that it's about asking the right questions, but also getting the diverse opinions. Like, you don't think that the waiter maybe sees anything, but until you ask the waiter, did you happen to see something on Sunday night? And he says, well, actually, when you asked me, and then that reflections. Good journalistic standards and as a discipline has definitely a place in research. Putting together a consortium, like who should be at this table, who should help us on this topic, and asking people, well, what do you think about this? Do you see something that I don't see? And that's just kind of good teamwork that helps research projects really come together.
Okay, so masterful segue towards your new paper. Are we ready to be wrong? I guess I'll let you introduce the paper, give kind of a 3-sentence summary of the main thrust, and then tell us your motivation for writing the paper. Why was it important for you to write this now? And if you've got any feedback how it's been received so far.
Yeah, the paper was written several years ago and submitted and totally rejected. So that's another type of thing, like never give up. And as we say in basketball and everything, teamwork makes the dream work. And the first paper failed because I didn't have all the pieces yet. It was a very good topic. So the editor says, this is a really great topic, but it's not there yet. And he didn't give very much advice afterwards, but okay, fine. I was rejected without a review, and it just kind of sat there. And then one of the best things, I guess there's two really good things that happened to me for my career during the pandemic. And one of them was, both have to do that we moved our conferences online, because when we did that, for the one really good thing was the SDG conference at the University of Bergen. When I got involved, when we decided to make it a live TV type of sending, as we say, that was just awesome. That's another topic. But also our post-normal science and practice conference went online. And when that went online, I got to meet a new person, Min Hyung Kim, a young woman from South Korea, who I think is one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. She went to Sciences Po in France and has studied in the US and is a philosopher of science and just starting to really get into post-normal science and that scholarship. And we hit it off at the conference. And then we had some meetings afterwards. And for whatever reason, I started talking about this mackerel case that we have in Europe, how to set the quota for Northeast Atlantic mackerel. And because this is a story that I've had in my head for at least 10 years, if not 15. And I've been following it, but I couldn't, in a way, get it published. Like, how do I get that story out? It's a fascinating story. Orally. And I've seen this story and talked to all the different experts and all the different, fishermen and all this type of stuff. So I know it all fits together really well as a reflexive question, but it was Min Hyung that came up with this question, are we ready to be wrong? And it was I think we spent 2 years on this because till this day, I still have not yet met Min Hyung in person. Now she has started a PhD in Bilbao. So now she's in Europe again. She was in Europe before the pandemic, went back to Korea, then now is back in Europe. So it's just a matter of months until we get to meet in person. She's probably the person I know the best without have ever met her in person. And it was Min Hyung's brilliant mind and the connection to philosophy of science and the philosophy of Miranda Fricker, which we go into more depth, which was obviously, in retrospect, such a huge gap. That was the gaping hole that the original editor could see that I couldn't get because I hadn't met the right colleague to help me. I put this into something that is more actionable. It's not just a story. It actually is a story with an anchor in the philosophy of science of saying we have to be diverse and inclusive in order to understand the limits of science, first of all, but then what do we do when science can't bring us the answer because there is no answer. But maybe it would help if I kind of explain a little bit of the story. Yeah. So the story is such that in Europe, there are annual assessments where scientists use statistical models to basically count fish. And they count fish, for example, of a certain stock. A stock is a grouping of like a species like mackerel, Scombus scombus. A Northeast Atlantic mackerel is a population of mackerel in the North Atlantic. And then we're looking at this at a stock level. So it's kind of connected to a geographical level because the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, ICES, we usually say ICES, the world's oldest intergovernmental science institution founded in 1902, is tasked with the scientific assessment of I think it's over 80 fish stocks now, and then to give the scientific quota. The scientific quota is what science recommends the fishers for that stock catch, but those fishers can come from, or you almost always come from, different countries. So Norway shares mackerel with UK after Brexit in the EU, for example. And that was historically how it's been for, the last decades. However, mackerel has to swim every second of its life in order not to sink because they don't have a swim bladder. So basically, mackerel is just it's the Ferrari of the sea. It's like tuna in that sense. Really fast. The mackerel can even become warm-blooded when they swim really fast because they're using so much muscle and they warm their blood. So mackerel is just like a super sexy fish. It's so awesome and it's so good for you and it's so healthy and it's so beautiful. Mackerel are just gorgeous. Anyways, so they're swimming every second of their life, but they have to find food. So they're just swimming after the food, right? So and the food has a lot more area to kind of fill because of warming waters. So phytoplankton would have kind of a natural northern boundary, but with warming seawater, phytoplankton can now go into other places and the current is bringing them and they're living, and then the zooplankton follow the phytoplankton, and then the mackerel are following the zooplankton. So it was maybe almost 15 years ago, mackerel started showing up in Iceland. And not just Iceland, started showing up in Greenland. And not just Greenland, there were reports, because I get the newspaper, of course, the fisheries newspaper, the national newspaper, of Norwegians standing on docks in Longyearbyen and Svalbard and fishing mackerel all the way up to Svalbard, all the way up to 78 degrees north. And this, first of all, it's amazing. It's like, wow, mackerel is getting around. And, they have to have a pretty big stock size to, survive all that. And that's very interesting. But this was a lot of anecdotal information as well, because our surveys, the scientific surveys, they're not going around Iceland and to Greenland, and we just can't cover that. I mean, these surveys, every 24 hours on the ship is easily $15,000-$20,000. So, I mean, you can't just follow the fish, right? And also the cruises that do the basis for the data for the assessments, the research cruises, these are predetermined and following a protocol that you have to keep consistent over time. Otherwise, you can't compare your time series. So you can't just follow the fish. The fishermen follow the fish. That's their job. The scientist's job is to follow the protocol. And the protocol is based on all these different statistics of where you need to carry out the assessment. So anyways...
So hold on, sorry. So one part of the story is that environment of the fish is changing. The scientific protocols were set up in a previous kind of environmental situation where the fish were in certain places. Now they're in new places. But not only is there just a problem of changing scientific inertia, but it's a problem if you change a protocol because you've changed something that's standardized and now it's not comparable.
Exactly. There are ways to change protocols, of course. That's another topic. It's in the ICES working group, set up. They do what's called a benchmark. You re-benchmark. You kind of put all the data back on the table, all the assumptions and all the frameworks and protocols, and you say, okay, what do we need to change anything? And if we do, how should we do that so it's up to scientific standards? And there could be a lot of external people to the system. Scientists that aren't doing the routine assessment will come in and help advise on how to benchmark. Benchmarks are usually done maybe every 3 to 5 years or something. It's just good scientific practice. It's like an external review, basically. But mackerel had been benchmarked 5 times the last 6 years. So the benchmarks were coming one after another because they couldn't get the signal. They couldn't really understand how much mackerel there was. And there was a huge discrepancy between the anecdotal and semi-anecdotal, but also, I mean, we have to also realize a lot that's changed in the North Atlantic. The technology on the fishing boats is almost the same, basically the same as the technology in our research boats. So when it's not so anecdotal to have a fisherman give you his echolod, as they say in Norwegian, the data where they've seen these huge schools of mackerel way out where the scientists have never been. So there's this discrepancy of, if you will, science and society, where important members of society who are very dependent on this stock for their livelihoods are saying, you guys have no idea how much mackerel there is. So it puts the scientists in a squeeze, and it is one of the best characterizations of post-normal science that I can actually think of. And I should probably mention what post-normal science is. So Thomas Kuhn in 1962 published a book. There's another cool thing in science that happened in 1962. Watson and Crick came up with the double helix structure of DNA and got the Nobel Prize. So that's probably what 62 is most remembered for. Also, Rachel Carson came out with Silent Spring in 1962, if I remember correctly. But I think the most exciting thing that happened, of course, Silent Spring is awesome, and that's another podcast. God bless Rachel Carson. But Thomas Kuhn, Austrian American philosopher of science, published a book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And that book is famous for many reasons. Usually Norwegian bachelor students have to read this as part of their X-Fil, because Norway, you don't really have liberal arts. So you have this X-Fil, which is kind of like a crash course in philosophy of science. Yeah. And that's where the book is famous also because he coins the term paradigm shift, which is really cool. And that's another fascinating topic. But for the purpose of this story, he also talks about science as puzzle solving, and he calls puzzle solving science normal science. You're just solving a puzzle, trying to figure out how, for example, how to get a man on the moon, which they hadn't done in 1962, but it's a problem that can be solved. Yeah. And there's different ways to solve it, but you solve it. Get a man on the moon, make a supersonic jet, if it's an engineering problem, but it can be solved. So two philosophers of science, Sylvia Fontowitz and Jerome Ravitz, Jerry Ravitz, both who are still going strong. They were working together. Sylvia was in the European Union in the Joint Research Center, and Jerry was at Oxford. And they started to think about, geez, there's so many questions these days that have super high systems uncertainty, that there is no answer. Things are so uncertain in many different fields of science, whether it be climate science or predictions or urban planning and population growth, or like we don't know what the number is going to be. And actually a number can't really describe the whole of the situation. And the stakes are really high, actually, if we don't know this, because we have to make urgent decisions about what to do for next year's budget, or what to do about climate change, or what to do about fish stock. We have to come up with that scientific quota next year, because that's the whole management system is dependent on getting that guidance. But what is that number? How many fish are in the sea? We don't know, but we can make predictions and projections and educated guesses. But the uncertainty around that is still very high. We have uncertainty that we know about, but also these unknown unknowns. For example, like how climate change is going to affect the stock the next 20 years or the next 5 years. We don't know, and you really can't know because it's not knowable. But yet the society and management system, in this case for natural marine renewable resources, is dependent on you knowing. You have to say something. You have to guide us. So Silvio and Jerry came up with this term post-normal science, where it's not puzzle solving anymore. But it's high systems uncertainty, urgent decisions, and high stakes. So they coined this, and the first papers came out, I think it was 91, and then 92, 93, 94 were a lot of sequential papers, mostly in the Journal of Futures, because that was one of the journals that was particularly in tune with this concept. And gave it some space. And actually the Science for the Post-Normal Age, Silvio and Jerry's seminal paper, it's the most cited paper in the journal's history. So then, lo and behold, longer story short, the University of Bergen ends up being a center of gravity for post-normal science, mostly through the work of Professor Roger Strand, who was a mentor of mine, Kjell Hies Hauge, who's now at the University College in Bergen, and Jeroen van der Sluis, a Dutch professor who used his PhD and postdoc to really apply post-normal science to the IPCC. And then I got exposed when I worked at the Center for the Study of the Sciences and Humanities in 2010 to 2014-15. And really getting close with Silvio and Jerry and how to apply this to fisheries. So they were also in absolute agreement and alignment that, Dorothy, this fisheries stuff, there's a lot to get into there. But there hasn't been a big community around it. And until I met Min Hyung, and now I really think that we can do a lot more proactively on how to bring post-normal science to fisheries. So we explain in the paper of how the mackerel case is a post-normal case. And basically rule number one, when you identified a post-normal problem, you need to extend the peer community. And that has been very blatant. And actually part of the scientific protocol of ICES is that it's the scientists that do the assessment. But what do you do when the assessment is broken? And there's other citizens and other stakeholders that have a huge stake in this, that have other types of information. So we problematize that ICES as an institution isn't ready to be wrong. And it goes back to the 2018 advice for mackerel, where I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like 748,639,000 tons. So there you have 6 significant figures, which first of all is a blatant miscommunication of the amount of uncertainty. So the rule of significant figures is in significant digits is if you have 6 significant ones, you are really quite certain they're going to the nearest ton of how much they're advising the quota should be. Everyone knows that that's wrong. It's mathematically wrong. You cannot know this number to the nearest ton, but that it's standard practice. And it has to do with the coastal state negotiations that they're going to haggle. They need the haggling over every single ton because of the political. But I have a problem with that because that is the political shouldn't influence the scientific, the math, basically, but it does. So that's one thing. A total miscommunication of uncertainty, and we problematize that and come with recommendations. But the fishermen, when this quota came out, the fishermen said there's no way that there's that much mackerel out there. And this is curious because usually the fishermen are telling the scientists that the quota is too low, that they're not seeing all the mackerel. But this was a case where it was the opposite. The fishermen said that number is not right. There's no way that there's over 700,000 tons of quota to be taken there. There's no way we can even take that quota. Where did you get that number? Your model must be broken. And it's the way this happens through the protocol that the member states of ICES that fund ICES has to go through. For example, Norway is a founding member of ICES in 1902, and also, of course, a member state of ICES. And the fisheries minister puts in a formal request to say this quota should be revised. So then it goes back. The scientists come back together to revise the quota, and they come up with a new number that's was it 80% below? Something like this, 369 tons. Exactly, still, but significantly lower. And the fishermen, this is then formally announced and advised to be the scientific quota for Northeast Atlantic mackerel. And then the fishermen's like, there's no way it's that low. And so you have a huge, 2 totally different perceptions of the same thing, where we know that science isn't really helping so much at this point. I mean, is it 700,000? Is it 400,000? What is it? And if you don't know, or if there's really big problems with a model, do we have to give an advice every single year? Isn't it good enough just to say, sorry, the model, we don't understand what's going on. There's different signals. Mackerel is inherently hard to assess. Everyone gets that. Scientists get that. The policymakers get that. The fishermen get that. So why are we playing a game where we're pretending to know? We're not ready to be wrong about this number, but we are inherently wrong because we cannot be right. And this is very humbling because, of course, this has been a very important paper for me personally to write, because I know and I deeply care about these institutions and these scientists that have had fabulous and very important careers on how to do fish stock assessment and how to give good scientific advice for the health of our ocean, for the health of our economies and our coastal communities. But in order to get to a 21st century understanding of natural renewable resources, we also have to critically assess what we have been doing the past 40 years and the appropriateness to bring us into a new decade of marine science, because I'm not convinced that we're doing our best. I'm not convinced that we are extending the peer community, as post-normal science would dictate, in order to help us with this problem. And so then the second part of the paper is reflecting on ICES as an institution and kind of this parallel universe that happens within the same institution. You have the hardcore stock assessment scientists doing the hardcore science advice. But in this parallel universe, you have a lot of momentum that has been gaining over the past 3-4 years on stakeholder engagement, which is fabulous. Yes, ICES as a science community of 6,000 scientists is understanding that, our member states, most of them being in the EU, have that core value of engagement and diversity. And that needs to be reflected in how we do science and advice. And so we connect that to all the really important work that has been done the last handful of years on stakeholder engagement. And as we do that, as we kind of follow these parallel tracks, the connecting of, a new generation or a new way of doing advice that is including a legitimate, incredible stakeholder participation and stakeholder engagement with all the caveats of, we still need independent science. No one is saying we not going to have that. But when we identify post-normal problems, we also know that there's independent science, and then there's a translation of that into advice. And that's its own mode of working, and that could and should include an extended peer community. So we put this all together, and I'm very excited to present this to the ICES Annual Science Conference in September. Min Hyung and I have a plan to be there. I also have a plan to embed Min Hyung in some of the discussions in ICES as part of her PhD, to kind of get that experience. And so far in the community, because we did a lot of interviews and a lot of fact checking and story checking to make sure that everything kind of fits together for the paper. And I think people are very happy that somebody is doing this. The pushback, I would say the pushback is quite minimal, because I think scientists, at least the ones that we talk to, nod their heads and say, yeah, there's some stuff going on. Now, how to change the protocols and benchmarks and how to actually make this happen is, for me, still a big question mark, because I know the ingredients. Like, I can tell you an ingredients for a chocolate cake, but how to bake that cake and what proportion and at what timing and all that, I don't know. That I would, and this is the thing that Silvio Funtowitz says. I think one of my favorite quotes is, sustainability science isn't a book you take off the shelf with recipes. So it's learning by doing. And so the goal for the paper was to be a conversation opener for the ICES community and for the fishing community and for policymakers to be like, okay, maybe single stock assessment and single stock advice is something that belongs to the last century. Multi-stock ecosystem advice, where we're also showing that, mackerel is really dependent on any other things, and the environment, the marine environment, marine ecosystems is very dependent on a healthy mackerel stock, because the urgent decision and the high stakes are also the fact that, per definition, Northeast Atlantic mackerel has been overfished for 15 years. And as a keystone species for the North Sea and the North Atlantic, we cannot risk collapsing a mackerel stock. We cannot risk that. And I think it's scary to think that we've been overfishing, because Norway, if I was to put my finger, and now I'll put on my hat as chair of the Nordic Marine Think Tank, Norway has a huge responsibility to admit that Iceland has rights to fish mackerel within its own economic exclusive zone as per the UN law of the sea, which means that when ICES gives the one scientific advice, whether it's right or not, it's just one advice that has to be shared with all legitimate coastal states. And Norway will not recognize Iceland as part of the shared stock, because of course that has economic repercussions for Norway. And so it's time for the Nordic countries to acknowledge the situation as it really is, and for Norway, and then also EU, UK, to acknowledge Iceland as part of the coastal state agreement. This, for people on the outside, this seems like a no-brainer. But this is really tough situation. And it's tough per definition because it hasn't been solved yet. So there's a lot at stake.
Okay, let me pause you there. Do you want a glass of water?
Yeah, I have some. Yeah, so we okay on time?
Okay, so let me drag you back to the normal, post-normal distinction. And I mean, I think we're all becoming more aware of big problems that have lots of uncertainty, lots of complexity, and where the scientific advice is either not simple or hard to follow. So, I mean, climate change, the poly crisis is the obvious example. I think that COVID gave everybody a really good crash course in the limitations of science, especially in situations of extreme time pressure. And then obviously, I think for the audience of this podcast, the deep sea mining question is another one where uncertainty is the elephant in every room. Okay, so your paper has a lot of very interesting concepts, which I think deserve explanation. Post-normal science,
Epistemic justice.
epistemic justice, epistemic authority, extended peer community. But I'd like to start with two more common words that are central in your paper that I think a lot about in my work. And this is uncertainty and complexity. How do you think about, or is uncertainty different from complexity? And how is that importantly different for scientific approaches to questions that have uncertainty, complexity? And I feel like we could get into further distinctions, like the difference between a complex, a complicated, and a random situation.
Yeah.
But let's start with just what are the different kinds of uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different types of uncertainty, and post-normal science scholarship has made this very explicit, and has come with this is a lot of the work that Professor Jeroen van der Sluis has done when he was at Utrecht, and also named one of the Netherlands' top. He was number 25 on a list of 100 most influential Dutch researchers for sustainability. So that was kind of cool. But then I didn't have anything to do with this, but the University of Bergen, I got him to make a full professor position at the Center for the Study of the Sciences and Humanities at the University of Bergen. And Jeroen has really expanded on the post-normal science method of NUSAP. NUSAP is an acronym. It stands for numeral, unit, spread, and assessment and pedigree. So let's just break down kind of uncertainty from that number, the 749,643 tons. So you have that number. It's right in front of us on the table. Here's the number. So let's break it down, right? So the N, in NUSAP, the numeral. Okay, we have the number and the unit in tons.
Tons of mackerel.
Tons of mackerel. And then the spread, the S, the spread. So that number, because we're doing Monte Carlo projections in the future, has like a high and a low spread of that number in the different projections. And then maybe that number that is on the table now is the average of that spread, for example, or the median. But then those are very quantitative ways to kind of understand, okay, what is this number? But then there's two qualitative aspects to that number that Jerry and Silvio called the assessments and the pedigree. So let's do the pedigree first, because that's the fun one. Because like all dogs and horses, for example, have a pedigree. Where do they come from? What's their bloodline? You can say the same thing for a number. What's the pedigree of this number? Where did it come from? Is it coming from a model ensemble? Is it across many different models have converged to give this number? Or is this just based on one model? And then who runs that model? How did it come up with? What's its origin, right? So who has been working on it? Has it just been two scientists from Norway, or is this kind of a community-based model that ICES has put together over decades, for example? So what's the pedigree? But then the assessment, and there's different ways to do this assessment. First, you can have grouping of experts that say, the group of experts in this discipline, in fisheries science, all agree that this is a strong number, that this is a good number. Or not all experts agree that this is a strong, robust number. And it would be fascinating. And actually, this is if anybody wants to put together a research project that would actually put NUSAP into ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea assessment process, and to do a survey of the scientists in the room what do you actually think about this number? Behind closed doors and, more or less anonymous, but to have that discussion, because, there's good and bad things about institutions. And a bad thing is when an institution has such pre-agreed or very stringent protocols where the individual is not free to think independently. And I see this happening in many different aspects. So this is absolutely not only related to fishery science, but is in so many other aspects. I would encourage the listeners to do this kind of experiment, or when you see a problem happening in society, a problem happening in politics, or a problem happening for an agency or something like this, ask, is this just a relic of the way the institution works? And what would be different in this if there were one or two or three people that said, what if we thought about this a little bit differently? And I've actually seen this in practice. If I can share another story that I think is fascinating. There's the Norwegian water resource, also NVE, the Water Energy Resources Directorate, who in Norway, who got the job from the Ministry of Energy to draw up the new areas for offshore wind in Norway. And offshore wind is a very important emerging technology, particularly floating offshore wind, of renewable energy to help us deal with our addiction to fossil fuels and to transition. Very important technology for the energy transition. So Norway wants to get on board and actually make a sector, make a business out of this and start electrifying. So NVE is charged, so a government institution is charged with identifying these new areas. Now, there's a lot of ways that they could start drawing the lines on a map. But there's this wonderful woman whom I'm a fan of, Annette Ødegaard, who took leadership and just trying to figure out what's the best way to approach this problem, and came up with a wonderful application of the extended peer community, where she consciously or unconsciously, it'd be fun to interview her on this, and maybe it came a bit top down that you need to include all these people, but she included all the different agencies, directorates, and some science institutions, for example, the Institute of Marine Research, in this, because she understood it as an inherently complex problem. That, okay, when you have complexity, you need more people to help you disentangle it. And there's going to be areas, you want to avoid areas of conflict. And they're not just fisheries, but perhaps one of the most important conflict areas with the military, for example. You just can't make an area not available to the military. It's the military that makes an area unavailable to you, particularly in the North Atlantic. So getting all these maps and overlaying those maps, all of a sudden you get a very complex picture. And I would not say that, I would say this is the difference between complexity and uncertainty. There's an uncertainty really here. These are the lines in the map that this agency, this group, this, different councils, aviation, this like that, say that this is where we operate. And so an offshore wind farm would be in conflict with our operations. But when you overlay all those data, it suddenly becomes really complex, because then you have to start thinking about trade-offs. So getting this extended peer community in an 18-month process. And also another part of extending the peer community is that you don't just have the one workshop and think that, okay, this is how it has to be iterative. So within these 18 months, a lot of back and forth, but then also, more maybe smaller discussions with a certain group to say, okay, but you drew these lines, but the trade-off is so great. Could you reevaluate those lines in light of this new information? And in the end, they came up with these 20 new areas. I think it was like 53,000 square kilometers of area that were deemed both appropriate for offshore winds and appropriate for the other actors in the area as low conflict. On paper, in the rhetoric and the press conference, sounded all good to me. but I have to, I guess this is kind of like the investigative journalism part, I have to get this verified by the stakeholders. And we had this this project where we had a lot of different offshore wind stakeholders, both developers and fishing representatives from the pelagic fleet and from the bottom trawl fleet and from the ship owners. And we have regular meetings. So right after that press conference, and by the way, that press conference in Oslo for the Water Resources Agency, they broke the internet as far as press conferences, because they weren't expecting so much outside interest to a NVE press conference in Oslo. But it was basically all the fishermen on the west coast of Norway on their, on 5G with their phones offshore were all tuning in, because this had such huge consequences for them where these lines were going to be drawn that they wanted to tune in. And there's one particular part of that press conference in Oslo. So for the listeners, the capital of Norway in Oslo is in the east part and very geographically and culturally separated from the fishing community on the western coast and in the north of Norway. So to have so many fishermen interested in that government press conference was very insightful for NVE to say, oh, geez, this has high stakes. There was getting back to the newspaper, I'm a big fan of Fiskeriblad, the national fisheries and aquaculture newspaper in Norway. And there's a journalist from the Fiskeriblad who asked a question at the press conference. And at this moment, I'm just like so excited but nervous, because here's Anette Ødegaard, who's a government bureaucrat who has done an excellent job and shown great leadership skills of making this complex picture credible and legitimate for the nation, was asked a question: how did you think about fish resources? Like, what type of data for fishing did you use? And for me, this was like a test. So I don't think ever there has been a question from an NVE press conference in Oslo about fish. And not only that, the answer, I wasn't quite expecting this either. So Anette said, well, we worked very closely with the fisheries directorate on the herring and the sand eel for these certain areas, but there are a lot of other species that we took into account. I'd like to invite my colleague Bård Aalbakke from the fisheries directorate, who's here today, to give you more information on that. And I'm like, awesome. And so Bård, who we know, of course, he works in Bergen, comes up on stage and he just starts giving, the best, nerdiest fish species answer to that question that is served on a platter for the fisheries newspaper is exactly what they wanted to hear, and was exactly showing how in depth, with the right experts, with the right sources of data, that they did. And I was just so pleased. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So they're talking really hardcore biology and a hardcore economy for the fishing instances. And this is bringing into an offshore wind context for the benefit of Norway as a country. I'm like, okay, this is the real deal. This is how our institutions are supposed to work. And I lend it not to the tunnel vision of an institution of business as usual. I lend it to individual leadership that says, you know what, we've never done this before. So let's think about what the best way to do it is. And I find it very inspiring. But I can't take it for granted just what I think. I need to verify this. So I brought this to the stakeholder meeting where we have developers and fishing representatives in the same meeting. I think it's really important that these two different sectors, fishing and energy, have these meetings so they can hear the other view. Because if they agree, it's like, great. That is like very interesting to move forward with the dialogue then. And if they don't agree, great. Let's break that down and understand. Because that's totally different than me going to talking to wind developers and blah, blah, and then me going to talk to fish, because then those sectors don't hear each other. I hear everything and I can put it together, but they need to also hear each other. So I started with I thought, okay, strategically, how should I do this? The fishermen are most likely to not agree. The developers are most likely to agree. So maybe I start with the developers. And we went down the line, and developer after developer says, yes, I agree on that. This was a great process. These 20 areas, this is definitely something we can work with. We think the process was good. Good. I think there were 5 or 6 developers from different. And then I have my 3 fishing representatives. And the first one said, yeah, we see the process. We agree with the process. There's one area that we don't agree with. That's in the South, but we've already written why we don't. And I said, for me, this is my view, and something I learned from Sylvia Funtowitz from Postnormal Science. It's not about the product. It's about the process. Mm-hmm. So that was my question to them. Okay, you don't agree with that one area in the South, but do you agree with the process? Was that credible and legitimate for you guys? Yes, they said. I go to the next fishing representative. Do you agree with the process? Mm-hmm. Yes, we think it was a very good process. And then the last one, do you agree with the process? The process was good. We don't agree with that area in the South, but we've written to them about that. And then to clarify, but you agree with the process? Yes. So there I have my, 15 something stakeholders around the table who are coming from different sectors and agree that the government's process was good. And I made this clear, and I said, this is something we can work with now because we have a process. And this can be and should be replicated when Norway starts to do real marine spatial planning. As long as we have a process that's credible and legitimate, and then salient of relevance for the stakeholders, we can work with uncertainty and complexity. But if we have a process where people it's not legitimate, it's not credible to start bringing new data in or new stakeholders in, or that the process is messy, that there's maybe one agency that is kind of taken over and is a hierarchy of over other agencies, and there's not individuals that can try to look at cross-sector collaboration would look like and all this. I think it's a very good example that I also bring into lectures for engineers, because I think for engineers to get closer to natural renewable resources beyond wind, but the living natural renewable resources, and how those are feeding the economies of coastal communities all up along in the Arctic, for example. I think it gives them a new light of how to attack or to embrace complexity.
Yeah. So in that story, and especially where not only in gathering all the information, but in presenting the information, when asked a question, she handed the microphone to someone else. It makes me think of the word intellectual humility, which ties in. I mean, I think a lot of your paper, both reflexivity and also a lot of these concepts of epistemic authority, epistemic justice, come back a little bit to, intellectual humility. And then I think part of that is people's comfort with uncertainty. Like I was reading actually last night an account of people making just kind of good and bad decisions, and they brought up Chernobyl and kind of walked through how that happened. And one of the things that they kind of took away was people who are uncomfortable with uncertainty look for answers and try to cram them into situations where answers maybe don't exist or they're not found yet, and they lack this self-reflection. And then they're also not open to being open to, if you are comfortable not knowing something, then you're going to be more open to looking for someone else who has good input, and especially looking for someone else, because I feel like sometimes well, I don't know this. I recognize that nobody knows this, but I have some authority, so I have to give an answer, as opposed to, I recognize that this is squishy, that there isn't an answer. And so even though this other person doesn't have a strong answer or doesn't have the right answer, I should include their perception of the uncertainty. I don't know how to make that into a question.
No, but this intellectual humility, what good is it? What is it? And is it helpful? Reminds me of a story about Niels Bohr, so the famous Danish physicist. Did Niels Bohr win a Nobel Prize? He probably did. I don't know. Anyways, Niels Bohr, the famous Niels Bohr, would gather PhDs and postdocs. They would have these, chats in the lab, coffee, cigarette, probably chats. And Niels Bohr, of course, he was the guru and the high intellectual. And so to be a PhD or postdoc in that lab, of course, when Professor Bohr sat down and started talking, you wanted to gather around and listen. And so they had very frequent, regular lab meetings, if you will, where Niels Bohr would just start talking. And finally, there was some brave postdoc that said, yeah, but Professor Bohr, what are you trying to say? And he said, I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say until perhaps I say something of value to pick up on. And that kind of humility, and also understanding that science is a process, that you don't maybe know where you're going, but you have to get stuff out. You have to purge your brain so that others can maybe say, yes, that I get that. And what about this? And that chain reaction of ideas that can happen. But you have to be quite humble to say that I don't know what I'm talking about right now. I have an inkling that something is in there, but I have to work it out. And will you help me work it out? That's also quite humble to say, I can't do this by myself. There's a really fun story that we have in the family where my husband is a researcher in the genetics and nutrition of obesity and diabetes. And he was at a conference during his PhD in Istanbul. And he came back from that conference so happy. He was like so happy. He's like, I'm like, how was the conference? Oh, it was so great. I went dancing and there was this girl there and she was just so awesome. And you got to meet her. You got to meet her. And I'm like, okay, who is this girl that you met in Istanbul and why were you on the dance floor? Because it wasn't exactly the thing I had thought in my head he was doing in Istanbul. And he's like, okay. He's like, listen, because he, in my opinion, this is my, what do you say? The way I had in my head, he just went with his poster to Istanbul and he didn't get an oral presentation, probably because he was like, in the middle of his PhD and didn't really have any papers to show, but he had some data and he put it in a poster. So then you're kind of like, what can happen? Like what big scientific breakthrough could actually happen with a poster? What happened is he's standing at his poster and this woman comes over, young woman, and points to a data point on the poster and says, that homeobox transcription factor, is that what I think it is? And they started this conversation. And for her, it was a huge epiphany because that data point was what she needed to confirm the experiments that she was doing and the mathematical theory of non-coding DNA aspects. And it was that intellectual boom. There it is. That she needed that. And my husband had no idea why she needed that, but to see someone else get that missing piece of the puzzle, humility to kind of go around and say, you know what, there's some, to go to different people's posters at a conference and be like, how does this relate to my work? And that's why we go to conferences. That's why we mix. That's why we converse. And, you can do that in a totally different way. And a long story short, Melina Klausnitzer and my husband, Simon Dankel, have had an amazing collaboration based on that poster. And then, of course, went on the dance floor. Now we're all close family friends. And I have also been working with Melina in a theory of science and ethics. And she has her lab in Boston and is working for Novo Nordisk and some, huge, awesome stuff. But the fact that, we are a community of scientists and we all have different pieces of the puzzle, but unless we're talking to each other, mixing, sometimes we say stuff that we don't quite know what it means yet. I go a lot back to that intellectual humility, and teamwork makes the dream work.
Wonderful. Well, I mean, I'm tempted to leave it there, given that we're out of time. I really wanted to ask you specifically how your post-normal musings should apply to the ongoing deep sea mining questions. I don't know if you have a few more minutes.
Sure.
If you would like to speak, because I know you're interested in deep sea mining.
I mean, I'm very interested in deep sea mining because it's also a very fascinating post-normal problem. High systems uncertainty, we know, I would say, quote unquote, nothing about the deep sea. Of course, we know something about some areas, but every time we go down to the deep sea, we find something new. And the vastness, of course, of the deep sea, it's the most unexplored part of the planet. It just very much lends itself to a post-normal problem of high systems uncertainties, urgent decisions, and super high stakes, not only the economic stakes, geopolitical stakes of rare earth minerals. But for me, the biggest stake is the natural stake. What happens to the environment? And that's the crazy thing, is we couldn't know. That would be the unknown unknown, because how do you know a change in an ecosystem when you've never mapped the ecosystem? I mean, it's like ridiculously unknown. So, I mean, it says itself that if you were to cause a major shift, or, that would affect ecosystems, that would have, ripple effects for different parts of the ocean, nobody's ready to take that risk. But how do you know that that's actually a risk? You can't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then some people would argue that, well, it's China having 80% access to or 100% access to 80% of the rare earth minerals is a bigger risk. The ocean can take care of itself. It always has. It always will. It's too too big to die, or something like this. I don't know. But I think that, if we go back to intellectual humility of how much we don't know about the deep sea, it says itself that we have decades of deep sea science before us before we can ever think about harvesting something that's non-renewable. But also the philosophical question of, the arguments of, well, we need these rare earth minerals to electrify and for the energy transition.
And so that we can slow climate change and its effects on the ocean.
Yeah. But then the question is, it's 2025. Why would we ever think about starting an energy transition, a renewable energy transition that's dependent on non-renewables, meaning minerals? That doesn't really make sense for the next 100 years. So it's like it's like that tunnel vision of like, okay, well, we know fossil fuels are bad, so we're going to electrify, but then we need rare earth minerals. So it just doesn't logically get into my mind. And also from an economic standpoint, I haven't seen any economic analyses that say that this could even be profitable the next 20 years. So what's the economic argument really? And then, of course, I get the geopolitical. You want to control that, but also about controlling technology. And wouldn't we want to be, the first nations that can do saltwater batteries, or something like, something that is a real innovation instead of old 20th century mechanics of how to generate electricity? So I'm of course very skeptical. I don't see a need of deep sea mining at all.
So what you're kind of saying is we have an appropriate approach to something that we know so little about and that's so important. And that approach is curiosity and investigation. And then this issue of trade-offs and how to solve the energy transition, given that, like, oh, look, there's shiny things down there, but we know so little about down there. You're kind of saying, well, we should stay in that situation. It's more appropriate to stay in places where we have more certainty. Look into technologies that we can solve this without such a huge risk.
Exactly. I mean, isn't that just pure logic?
Yeah. I mean, that framing is very sensible. And I feel like it encompasses a lot of the deep sea mining discussion. People will say, yeah, but we really need to get these minerals. And yeah, it's uncertain, but everything's uncertain, yada, yada.
Yeah. I see just in this conversation that if we were to think of good things that come from the deep sea mining conversations in Europe and in Norway, for example, is that finally we're talking about the deep sea. So I think that's great. That's fabulous, because I do think the cure for cancer is in the deep sea. I think a lot of the solutions are in the deep sea, and I get very inspired talking to our deep sea scientist at the University of Bergen. Reeves I'm a huge fan of him, and when he told me about the story behind his Nature paper about getting the first data from the hydrothermal vents at 80 degrees north under the sea ice, which is some of which is featured in the Netflix series Our Oceans, in the Arctic episode where we were involved. That when NASA saw these chemophiles and these living organisms at 4,000 meters deep at 200 degrees plus Celsius under the sea ice in the Arctic, NASA realized and made a statement that with more deep sea research and more money that is perhaps funneled out of NASA's, I'm all for exoplanet research, but the deep sea research is totally underfunded. And they realize that if they put more money into deep sea research, significant money into deep sea research, not symbolic, within 100 years, NASA said they think that they can come up with understanding the origins of life in the universe. And that's something that, for me, is a statement of high significance that should inspire many other sectors to understand that by understanding our own planet, it's also a reflection of understanding us as humans. Galileo looking at the moons of Jupiter and all these fascinating things that deep space has given us. Ultimately, it's a reflection on who we are as humans on this earth. And I find it particularly interesting when Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos want to colonize Mars. Because for me, that's a dystopia. I sure as hell don't want to go to Mars. They can if they want to. That's fine. It's a free world. But when other billionaires like Ray Dalio from Ocean X say that, you know what, it's the deep sea. We have the technology to explore the deep sea. We have the technology, DNA and all this other awesome stuff to understand marine life at 7,000 meters deep. Here's the infrastructure. You give us the scientists. Let's go do deep sea research and bring that straight to heads of state so that they can see the other living and non-living citizens within their economic exclusive zones and give a voice to them. And that is inspiring. I love Ocean X and our collaboration that we've had with them with the University of Bergen, the future collaborations we'll have with them, because deep sea is where it's at. So you know that Likali, my girls at home will tease me about this, but there's that remix of Likali's I Follow Rivers. Do you know? Oh my gosh. Okay, but you have to play that as part of this podcast because there's this great beat and this line that comes out of nowhere. That's deep sea baby, I follow you. And I love it that that to have that song when I work out. It's like I follow you, deep sea baby. And it's a kind of a popular song, and then people a lot of people will recognize that song, but let's talk about the deep sea.
Wonderful. Okay, well, let's leave it there. Dorothy, thanks so much for giving me so much of your time. Let our listeners know where they can keep up with you, where they can find out more about postnormal science, plug your Netflix.
Yeah, well, Netflix Our Oceans is Netflix's biggest nature documentary. It is a monumental of nonfiction entertainment. James Honeyborn and Jonathan Smith were a dream to work with. Caroline Menzies and Alex Fennell, who produced the Arctic episode. Awesome. Totally inspirational. And there'll be more to come definitely from there. Google postnormal science. Go on YouTube. Silvio's given talks, Jerry's given talks, lots of cool discussions on postnormal science. And then for me, LinkedIn is the new Facebook. Mm-hmm. So I tried to prioritize more and more posts about traveling around to different meetings and talking about the same topics that are bringing people together, like postnormal science. And if anyone wants to collaborate on research projects, of course, I'm only an email away.
Wonderful. Okay. Dorothy Dankel, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Eric. Do you have like an intro jingle where you're like...
I actually got Jesse to send me one.
It's perfect, of course. I would love to see him again soon.
I throw my arms up and to the side, but I get tired after a while. Not like tamarack, I'd like to live straight and true. I'd like you to love me the way you do. The way you do, tamarack.